Okay, happy July 4th, everybody. I hope this is going through well. Um, First Baptist Church Gallatin College and Career Class. Let's go. And at some point, maybe Kyle or somebody give me a little hints. I know that it's actually coming through. But today, what we're talking about, we're still working through the Baptist Faith and Message, and we're going to be talking about church and state today. So this is a really complex, well, religious liberty technically, but this is a complex topic. There's a lot going on. We're going to cover it uh, in about the best way I could think of. Anyway, strategically, what I'm going to do is we're going to look over kind of the three most dominant historical and in recent memory, but views of church and state, how they relate. And then after we kind of go through that historically just a little bit, we're going to walk through the Southern Baptist Faith and Message. I'll kind of read through that. We'll get some of the verses involved there, and then kind of have some finishing thoughts. This will be an unusual day, but hey, it's July 4th. It's a good day for a little bit of a history lesson. Although it won't be much of one, it'll be brief. There, everything I touch, there's so much to it, and even if you ask among Baptists, just like any other group, like people's opinions will change and will diverge in numerous spots here because a lot of even the Southern Baptist Faith and Message, some of the stuff can be taken in different ways. But okay, I see Cal. Cal's here, so hello, Cal. I've got one. All right, so let's get started. As I said, the first thing I want to cover is kind of your three dominant views right now and over the past couple centuries. And so that is that the state over church is a general view people take. I'm talking religious liberty. The state's more important. That's secularism. You say that among positivist groups. But that would be an example of that. Well, we'll get there in a second. But secondly, theocracy is another word, is church over state, and there's various forms of that. We'll talk a little bit about theonomist and biblionomist, or different words for it. But we'll go through that briefly, and then finally the kind of Jeffersonian view, which is effectively church cooperation between church and state, and that's the American founders, of course, and the Southern Baptist Message reads a lot in line with that, even some of the terminology. And so, but first, okay, so our brief overviews. Secularism, which is a state over church, you see that in Marxism in general, like the old Soviet Union, for example, China in the past. It's countries where basically the state determines what the church can or can't do. In the case of China and the Soviet Union at points, I mean, even making religion illegal. The Nazis would have been in this realm as well. Germany, basically, Hitler was the new Christ to them, is how he termed it, I guess, or how it was termed. But basically, if you didn't believe the way he did, you might end up in a concentration camp. And so, we won't spend a lot of time on this, but obviously the Southern Baptist Faith and Message, we reject that view as America has in general. You look at, though, there are some Americans who have followed this viewpoint, like John Dewey and other famous atheists throughout American history. But in 1933, I'll just use their own words. The Humanist Manifesto won. I think it was the first one signed. There's a second one as well. But the way they put kind of this worldview, or part of it in, is that the nature of the universe depicted by modern science makes unacceptable any supernatural or cosmic guarantees of human value. And so effectively, that a rejection of morality, and later they added that moral values derive their source from human experience. Ethics is autonomous and situational and needing no theological or ideological sanction. And so, of course, America rejects this worldview, but what they're saying there basically is, morality is relative, and whatever the state deems moral is moral. And so, I mean, and it's funny. I mean, you had John Dewey and them sign the first charter right before the Nazis killed 6 million Jews under that viewpoint. So, just kind of like, and we'll get a little bit more to that in a minute. But you have theocracy is the second one. The second viewpoint. This is church over state, and this many even Christians have followed this viewpoint, of course. So examples of this, and I'll say Theo, it comes from theos, which means God, and arche. I'll probably pronounce most of this stuff wrong, but it means rule of, but effectively rule of God. It's, of course, the Old Testament. There's the Old Testament, the Old Promise, the Old Testament, and the New Testament. so that they separate. But the Old Testament was that God created a theocracy. Now it was a little different than some of the others in ways. In its own way, it was voluntary. Now, obviously, in ancient Israel, there was you would be put to death if you worshipped any other god. But God still gave them the option, and they all throughout the Old Testament they did not follow God, and so He didn't bless them, and they're very punished in various ways. But so it's strange to look at. It's really is involuntary, but also voluntary in a way. And I won't go further into that today. But I'll say today you still have theocracies as well. Iran, I don't know that it is any longer, but for a long time it was. Anywhere the Taliban moved, that's theocracy, where effectively they dictate morality. And so those groups, and then even within the church, interestingly, the Reformational state churches, John Calvin set up one of the first. He established the state church in Geneva, Switzerland, and he had at least one heretic, Michael Servetus, burned at the stake for his divergent religious beliefs. But effectively, some of the early churches, even within Christian recent memory, set up these type of theocracies, and oftentimes we'll get to later in the future. But Baptists ended up on the short end of the stick a lot of the times. But another one, the Puritans in Massachusetts, that they for a while that they also the same thing. It was they actually went to persecuted Roger Williams, the founder of the American Baptist. He actually fled from them in that persecution to Rhode Island, where he founded Rhode Island. I mean, in 1636. And it was a state. It did not have a state religion, which many colonies did, by the way, even after America was founded. I think I'll sit down. We'll get into that a little bit more later. But it's interesting to look at. But that was many of the states did, by the way, talk about. But now we're going to get to the Jeffersonian worldview, the Jeffersonian view, the third view, and this is the view America adopted as a whole, and they didn't necessarily apply it to states, but the federal government initially. And this is the Jeffersonian view is church cooperating with the state. This is the natural law view. It's named for Thomas Jefferson. And like all these areas, it's not like there's one exact theocracy or one exact Jeffersonian view or any of them. That they all there's a sliding scale. How far they are, how strict or less strict. But an example, Jeffersonian countries include Canada, which never had a state religion. Britain would be in this group. It did have a state religion, but I mean later on they didn't persecute other people though. Post-Revolution America, even after we were founded, although like I said, the federal government could not establish a religion. 10 of the 13 states had an official religion. 6 of them, I think, directly, and 4 of them kind of less directly. It wasn't until 1947 and the Everson versus Board of Education decision that America states could no longer hold a religion or have an official religion. But the idea behind the Jeffersonian view or Jeffersonianism is, like I say, cooperation between church and the state. They want to avoid both extremes of secularism and theocracy. And so effectively, I'll just read this part for you, is the Jeffersonian view. It denies that there is no divinely given moral law or natural law, but it also denies that any special revelation from God is the divinely prescribed basis for civil government. So it also denies that any national church should be established religion of the land, allowing religious freedom beliefs for all groups. And again, there are some differences. There, the states could still do it for a while, but we'll get to the Baptist viewpoint in a minute, though, on that. But this is really interesting topic to look into. Anytime you're reading the Declaration of Independence or founding documents, you'll see a lot of this viewpoint. Because what they did is they based civil government on nature's law, which comes from nature's God. So it's still, of course, it's still a moral viewpoint. Of course, it's still based on religious belief. But it was established without establishing any specific denomination, really is the way to put it, the founding fathers, but or we say any religion, but except a broadly kind of theistic or deistic, but a belief in a creator God who gave certain unalienable rights. A belief that according to God, that according to God is part of the general revelation to all humankind. So effectively, we're going to go into this. There's some biblical base. There's a biblical basis for it. Romans 1:18 through 20. Let me read this. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their upright unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. And that's one of the chapters. I'm going to read one more verse, but you can see in there his eternal power, divine nature, having been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world. The idea is whether you're Christian or not Christian, there are certain things God wrote on your heart. You know certain things are right or wrong, and that's what they call natural law. Also, Romans 2:14 through 15. For when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them. And again, the point is that everybody, whether Christian, non-Christian, whatever view you have, God put certain laws on your heart, certain kind of a natural law, and you know better than to just do anything. And so, believers in natural law, I mean, Richard Hooker, 1553 to 1600, defended the law in England, and it was a lot of his views were put by John Locke, who was instrumental in the foundation of American law. But they all argue basically good civil government is founded on natural law. And this, when you read the Declaration of Independence, and I said other founding documents, you'll read a lot where it'll mention nature's law or nature's God, and a reference nature. That's what they're referencing. This idea from Romans, everybody has some understanding of right or wrong. And so let's see, look on how I'm going to do this exactly. But we'll go on a little, and like I said, in the Jeffersonian view, it's still allowed for some support of church by state, and most certainly call for representatives to freely follow their beliefs when legislating law. Where a point I want to make across is okay. So like the Jeffersonian view is what America adopted, and Baptist view is very similar to it, but there's still disagreement on how much involvement church and state could have. The idea is, and we'll get more into this, I'm sure, several times, but church there should not be an official church of the state. The state should not choose one denomination over another. Um, but of course, I would say one of the first acts of Congress was to print a Bible for use in schools. Congress would often, this is our founding fathers, they'd often open with prayer and even Bible studies at times. Even we'll talk later about Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptist. 2 days after writing that letter, Thomas Jefferson sat in the House of Legislators in a church service, basically. And so the key view, a lot of the founding fathers, I think, their view is effectively even assumed Christianity, but they didn't want one denomination over another. And so it's more complex than just to say that they did not. There's a complete separation of church and state. But like I said, 10 to 13 colonies had official state religions. Most states still, even after America became a country, required representatives to be Christian or profess a belief in God, which we do not anymore. And for that matter, but even the president today will still swear on the Bible. But the point is, on this, there's a lot of differences, and the Southern Baptists do not take a strictly, I don't think, Jeffersonian view. It's similar, but not strictly. We'll get into that. But obviously, we're in a different spot today than we were back then. 1947, states in our country are no longer allowed to have an official religion. That's when that changed. But one thing I'm not going to go a ton into today, and I hopefully is creating a little bit of this there, is sometimes there's an idea of people say you shouldn't legislate morality. I'm not going to go deeply. I don't think the Southern Baptist Faith and message on this is really relevant to that, or I won't say not relevant, but it's more the ideal of the church should not establish this religion, as we'll go into. Because the truth is, no matter what view you have, all views legislate morality. I mean, it's an exercise in futility to try to argue you shouldn't legislate morality. And as a point, and that includes Southern Baptists, I think most Southern Baptists would admit that, although maybe some who try not to, but look, even the Baptist view that you shouldn't church and state should be kept separate to a degree is its own like moral argument. Anytime someone talks about what a government ought to do, they're really asking moral questions and to kind of try to clarify every government I know of has various laws against murder, rape, theft, and I don't think anybody disagrees with that, with those laws, with having those laws. And so everybody is to some degree okay with legislating morality. I mean, that's 90% of what you legislate is you shouldn't steal your neighbor's stuff because it's bad. And as I mentioned earlier, what I talked about is the Nazis briefly. They actually made an argument. After World War II, when they were captured, the Nuremberg trials, I've mentioned it before, they actually argued that it was okay what they did because there was no, they were following the law of their land, and basically that they took the secularist viewpoint of whoever's in control, positive viewpoint, whoever's in control determines morality. And of course, America and most of the Western civilization said, no, there's natural law, you violated it. And you see a large distinction there, the argument between secularism versus the Jeffersonian view, some type of natural law. And another example, and this is a good example, good enough, I'm going to use it even though I will mess up. Probably everybody's name, the locations, everything. But there's a chief in named Ratu Udre. I think his name is a chief of Raki in northern area in Fiji's largest island of Viti Levu. Like I said, I probably pronounced everything wrong there. But this guy, he was the most prolific cannibal of the 19th century. He ate between like 872 and 1,000 people. He was the chief, and the question was he wrong to do that? And he didn't think so apparently. But today we all agree Soylent Green is a bad idea, both people on the right and left. So this is an area where a lot of people do have, I think, agree, whether they realize it or not, on whichever side you are on, is that to some degree legislative morality is good. None of us are going to be cool, like I said, with Soylent Green. And if you don't get the reference, by the way, Soylent Green, it is a 1970s Charlton Heston movie. But effectively, cannibalism's bad. And there are some things we all agree on. So this topic sometimes gets very people obviously get angry and passionate one side or the other, and sometimes it's called, I guess, the fallacy of equivocation. It becomes that there's a difference. Sometimes people argue about what should the church and state, how should they be involved in each other, but I think it's kind of a separate argument to say should should government legislate morality. That's kind of a separate thing that I'm not going to go into a lot today, other than kind of what I just went through. All right, let's get to the Southern Baptist Faith and Message, see if I have it here. I'm just going to read it, be the simplest way to do it, and then we'll kind of walk through it a little bit. But God alone is Lord of the conscience, and he has left it free from the doctrines and commandments of men which are contrary to his word or not contained in it. Church and state should be separate. The state owes to every church protection and full freedom in pursuit of its spiritual ends. In providing for such freedom, no ecclesiastical groups or denominations should be favored by the state more than others. Civil government being ordained of God, it is the duty of Christians to render loyal obedience thereto in all things not contrary to the revealed will of God. The church should not resort to the civil power to carry on its work. The gospel of Christ contemplates spiritual means alone for the pursuit of its ends. The state has no right to impose penalties for religious opinions of any kind. The state has no right to impose taxes for the support of any form of religion. A free church in a free state is the Christian ideal, and this implies the right of free and unhindered access to God on the part of all men, and the right to form and propagate opinions in the sphere of religion without interference by the civil power. All right. So, like I said earlier, parts of this are we'll go through it a little bit more here, but a lot of it, I think, most Southern Baptists would agree with, most Christians agree with, and then there are parts where like details people probably even I reading through this is like, depending on what pastor or what Southern Baptist you talk to, they may differentiate on kind of the details a little bit. But let's start off. The first part, God alone is the Lord of the conscience, and he has left it free from the doctrines and commandments of men which are contrary to his word or not contained in it. Church and state should be separate. The state owes to every church protection and full freedom in the pursuit of its spiritual ends. For this is I'm going to cover some of the verses mentioned here. Let's see. There's several verses actually mentioned at the bottom, and I kind of read through them, so I wanted to cover some of them. I think this first part, this works. First of all, Genesis 1:27. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. And again, I think this is relevant to church and state part because what the verse is effectively is we're created in the image of God. I mean, kind of that idea of freedom of choice. We have free will. Genesis 2:7 is also here. Then the Lord God formed the man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living creature. Another emphasis on just the value of men in general, and that you're uniquely made. And I think this is the Southern Baptists. I think they're drawing from some of this. Just to point, I mean, people were created uh, to have, I mean, with free will, and they should be free to kind of choose what their beliefs will be. And I know that's the view that the Baptists are taking. And then 13, Philippians 3:20, but our citizenship is in heaven, and from it we await a Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ. So again, here you have church and state should be separate. Look, our citizenship in the end is in heaven. It's we're citizens of the United States, of course, and we love a country, the best country in the history of the planet, I think. But at the end of the day, what's more important is our relationship with Christ, and we're citizens of heaven, effectively. And that means part of that the emphasis they're putting here is we should be trying to witness to people freely. Shouldn't be trying to force them to do one thing or another, or create a perfect kingdom kind of here on earth. I mean, it's not going to happen. And the reformists and so many of the groups that did it fell victim of like legalism, stuff like that. Almost like if they forced everybody to do right, people would go to heaven. That's not how this works. And I think that's some of the weakness in some of the even Roman Catholic and later Reformed churches that tried to create a scenario where you had church over state, as they were kind of overlooking, I think, some of this. But moving on in the Southern Baptist faith and message, in providing for such freedom, no ecclesiastical group or denomination should be favored by the states more than others. This is a really interesting that they put it that way to say ecclesiastical group or denomination, because generally when you're talking about it, you're still talking about all Christian groups. And so that does read similar to a lot of the founding fathers, and a lot of the founding fathers' intent was to be a Christian country, but they just didn't want the federal government telling states they had to be one denomination or another. Um, and so there's some argument to be had there between historians and everybody, which I'm trying not to go into much. There'd be the group that say no, the church, the state should not support Christianity whatsoever or any religion. Others would say, well, the intent was more. They kind of all knew they were Christian at the time. Like depending on the study, 90 something percent, that's as high as 98% of the founding, during that time were Christians. They all kind of were coming at this from a understanding that this is a Christian nation in general, I guess would be the way to put it. They just didn't want one denomination dominating others or forcing taxes, for example. But all right. But I'm gonna move on. Civil government in the Southern Baptist message goes a little bit farther than that. By the way, we'll get there in a minute. But civil government, being ordained of God, it is the duty of Christians to render loyal obedience thereto in all things not contrary to the revealed will of God. And this is, you can see where this starts to get really complex biblically, but let's look at a couple of the verses here that are listed below that the Southern Baptists that they draw this from. So this is Romans 13, 1 through 7. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is a servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. And the other verse I'll touch or read real quick is 1 Peter 2, 12 through 17. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or to the governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. Okay, so and this again, First Peter, it's so clearly these verses are put here that we should be the civil government is ordained by God, and we should be obedient to the civil government. But notice it has the words in there, things not contrary to God's will, and that's important in understanding those verses from Romans as well. He also, in both those verses, he also says the government's role, which is to punish evil. And so there's the other side of this, where the government is not punishing evil or doing their part. You don't necessarily have to, then you don't have to obey the government, and that's not a random thing. That's a biblical viewpoint. I mean, we'll go into it briefly. Never mind the Old Testament being replete with Israel overthrowing, evil governments taking control of them. But like both Bible verses mention what the government's supposed to be doing. And remember, in the same time, that the very people writing both of these both routinely disobeyed the government, right? Like Peter and Paul were both martyred, in fact, because they wouldn't they would not stop sharing God's message. So they were ordered at point of death, stop doing this, and they disobeyed directly. And I think where's the one of the verses mentioned to that. I'm trying to look for it here. Okay, Acts 4:19 through 20. But Peter and John answered them, whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you rather than to God, you must judge. For we cannot but speak of what we have seen and heard. So that was again, so you still put God first. When government asks you to do something bad, then you don't have to obey. The government's not doing its job. Obviously, I'm not getting into, was the American Revolution bad or good? I mean, I think it was a good thing. People go back and forth on it though. But the point is, you don't always do what the government says, and that's a biblical concept. Another example of it would be the Nazis, right? Like Pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer ended up being put to death by Nazis. But he tried to, I think he's part of the plan to assassinate Hitler. But as just an example, should they have been, doing what the Nazis told them to do with Jews, etc. in Germany? Of course not. Like, so those verses. People tend to sometimes overuse them a little bit to make it like no matter what you obey. That's not what the Bible teaches. You have to understand all the Bible within context. We're to try to obey the civil governments is they're established by God to do good. But there are times when you don't, and the Southern Baptist Message has that in there. All things not contrary to the revealed Word of God. And Cal made a comment earlier. Unfortunately, church history is littered with examples of attempts to evangelize with the sword. We taught our children about the Vikings this week, and when the Catholic Church attempted to reach them, they were often converted by force with threats. Let's see, I'm trying to read. Threat of extreme persecution. And yeah, we think that's wrong today, and that's exactly right. And a lot of, like I was mentioning earlier, I mean, Zwingli is an example. I didn't prepare him as part of the lesson, but he's one who was actually key. He was a Protestant who was killed by Catholics, basically fighting against them for freedom. So the Catholic Church did that. In general, they're the problem when you run into reformationists or groups that try to make the church over the stage. You still end up with evil leaders somehow sneaking in, and then they end up doing really bad things that are inconsistent with their own worldview. And that is kind of one of the differences when a Christian does something like that. They're doing something that their worldview doesn't teach. I think I'm getting more to that here in just a second. Okay, so the church should not resort to civil power to carry on its work. That takes it a step farther than A and B, and maybe even the founding fathers to a degree. I don't know. It would depend on the founding father. You'll hear somebody give a debate of, here's proof the founding fathers thought this, or here's proof they thought something on the right or left, and they'll like name three guys and some of the stuff they said, and it's like there were a bunch of founding fathers. I mean, they disagreed with each other. You can't take quotes from two or three and have the entire, you basically, what was actually written into law was the Jeffersonian views. But you do, it goes back and forth a little bit. But the church should not resort to the civil power to carry on its work. That's what Baptists believe. So we're not asking the church to proselytize, certainly not with the sword. And the gospel of the next in the Southern Baptist Faith and Message, the gospel of Christ contemplates spiritual means alone for the pursuit of its ends. And that would go more to what Cal just put. Spiritual means only. And I thought the best example of this, if you look at John 18:36, this is not actually a verse of Southern Baptist Faith and Message list there, but this is when Jesus, well, he repeatedly, and this is one time he made it clear that his kingdom was not of this world. So the Jews were, when Jesus came, were expecting a political leader who was going to, raise Israel back to where it had been, a powerful kingdom, and that wasn't God's role. That wasn't what he was trying to do. And anyone he witnessed to, I mean, it was always freely. And when Paul, Peter, all of our stories from the New Testament, all of them without exception, were they were witnessing to people and giving people a choice whether to believe or not. It's those verses we read earlier from Genesis. People were created in the image of God with free will, and it makes it's perfectly consistent, or it is the Christian worldview, and it's consistent with the Southern Baptist Faith and Message as it should be, for that people should have the choice to choose. You should not be forcing them to. And interestingly, too, you mentioned the Vikings. What ended the Viking threat was, in fact, Christianity. A lot of Vikings did end up becoming Christians, and not just at the point of sword. They truly believed it, and they at that point realized murder's bad, and that really a lot of historians, will credit Christianity a large part of the end of the Viking raids. Not all of it, and it'll go back and forth on who you listen to. But there have been plenty written about that. So not all of it was done in an inappropriate way, but almost any point in history you look at, you're going to find somebody somewhere. I mean, there's a lot of people out there, and so there's always going to be outliers, or even and from time to time there'll be times in history where a lot of the church hasn't been involved in something it shouldn't have been. I guess is what I'll say. And I'll try not to go too far into that because obviously a lot of godly men in every age as well who did a lot of great things for God. So I'm not trying to cast dispersions on the church as a whole, but just say there are always going to be some outliers. Or yeah. All right. So moving on with the Southern Baptist Faith and Message, the state has no right to impose penalties for religious opinions of any kind. The state has no right to impose taxes for support of any form of religion. A free church in a free state is a Christian ideal, and this implies the right of free and unhindered access to God on the part of all men, and the right to form and propagate opinions in the sphere of religion without interference. Sorry, I wrote that down wrong. By the civil power. So again, this is some of this is pretty straightforward. The church, Southern Baptist Faith and Message, shouldn't be taxing people, shouldn't be penalizing people for their religious beliefs, and a free church in a free state is our ideal, and that's an excellent thing. And the right to form and propagate opinions in the sphere of religion without interference by civil government, also crucial. And there's a lot of debate over this today. Even some basic Christian viewpoints being labeled as hate speech, stuff like that. There are a lot of people attacking that viewpoint, but the fact Southern Baptist Faith and Message, the Southern Baptist view in general, is people should be able to express whether it's stuff we like or don't like, their own religious opinions. And but that is opinions. I just say opinions mean kind of doesn't just mean you can do anything. And this is where this topic tends to get really complex. And where do you draw the line? I don't know exactly. It depends on who you ask to. But do keep in mind we're talking about opinions here, so that doesn't mean so. I'll give a few examples. So a cult leader can teach whatever he wants to his group, right? Like Marilyn Manson can teach whatever he wants to people. But when they go murder a bunch of people, that's no longer opinion. Now you're in you're stepping outside what the Southern Baptist, what our message is actually references. You can't just kill people. Okay, and another example would be you can't sacrifice children to Molech, for example. So you can, your religious beliefs you follow, you can express the opinions, but you can't start hurting other people. And that's why this gets convoluted because the idea of why can't you hurt other people? Well, that is, in and of itself is a religious viewpoint we are forcing on other people. So just that murder is bad, right? You see the same thing within a Muslim cleric can teach whatever he wants to his congregation, but if he starts demanding jihad and they go out and just decapitate people, at that point, no, you're no longer free to do that. Why? Well, again, because it's wrong. So in a way, so again, there is some legislation of morality here, and the underlying Jeffersonian view is kind of the Christian worldview, and I think the Southern Baptist Faith and Message leads that intact. See, Cal made another comment. We shouldn't use the government to force people to believe in God, and indeed we can't. Yeah, I mean, people are free to believe. Even if you do, all you're doing is you're making them with their lips service it, but that's not actually going to mean they're going to be saved. In fact, they may well be turned against the gospel if you're sitting there forcing it to them. That the entire message of Christ was consistently love. Through love, reaching out to people through love, not force. That literally flips the gospel on its head in a way. But as Cal said, we should use the government to promote justice, and as Paul says, punish evil. And as Jacob has pointed out several times, without reference to God, we have no way of determining, what is evil. And that's what I'm saying. That's why this whole debate of church and state gets a little convoluted sometimes. But at the end of the day, we all believe in that the church and state. The different view is that they work together and cooperate. And frankly, even the secularist view that believes that the state is over the church still is enforcing its own set of morality. I mean, there's no way to escape the fact that you're going to be legislating morality to some degree. And you said several times, maybe I've said it too many times now, but okay. So I'm just trying to throw out there to everybody that these issues are a little more complex than they sound at first. But the general viewpoint going to the Southern Baptist faith and message and what it's pushing, where I think all Southern Baptists would agree, is the church should not establish a state, shouldn't interfere, shouldn't be taxing different groups, and shouldn't favor one church over another, like I guess you'd say formally through declaration or something like that. Obviously, again, where it gets complex then is, I mean, clearly I think some of the Baptists would agree, and most people in still agree that it should favor the Christian worldview over, say, some worldview that involves sacrificing children. I mean, right? We don't want that in our country. So that it gets complex. We have a lot of good discussions on it, and where the line is exactly that it may depend person to person. But I wanted to go over finally a little bit more about the Baptist specifically role in history. So it's pretty cool. As far back as England, English Baptists were outspoken against government interfering with religion and matters of conscience. That's been a long thing that's been fairly consistent in the history of Baptist is government leave us alone, leave people alone, let them decide. Even when it's stuff that we don't agree with, generally people are free to express that belief. You have to leave them alone. The area of the conscience is the Lord's, and that is not for the state to interfere in. And as Cal pointed out, and I hope I was pointing out there somewhere. I mean, that's the exact opposite of what Jesus teaches to do. Supposed to be forcing people to accept Christ. Now you force them not to murder others. There are some religious things you force, but yeah. Now Roger Williams, as I mentioned earlier, he was actually persecuted first in Massachusetts, and he established Rhode Island. He established well, let's read from here. He was established one of the first, I don't know if it was the first Baptist churches, but one of the early churches, but he established Rhode Island in 1636 as a state where people could freely worship based on their own conscience. He had been run out of Massachusetts. Again, kind of a cool history for Baptists here, for both speaking out against the Massachusetts government punishing people for religious viewpoints, as well as for confiscating Indian land. He thought that what they had done, how they confiscated Indian land, was wrong, and so he was opposed and was persecuted for that, for those viewpoints, and so he fled, had to flee, and established Rhode Island, and then later the big one everybody knows of, and this is the one that's kind of tragic in a way too, because this one has been turned on its head a little bit more recently. But the Dansbury Baptists are famous because the whole concept of separation of church and state, or the language that's used, not the concept, the language that's used, comes from a letter or letters, a couple letters between the Dansbury Baptists and Thomas Jefferson. The Dansbury Baptist, I think it was October 7th, 1801, I have sent to the newly elected Thomas Jefferson a letter where they were effectively stating him they were concerned about whether or not the federal government was going to, establish religion or force uh, other states, try to force states to follow one denomination or another. And I was going to just read Thomas Jefferson's letter back to them because I thought, hey, why not? It's a history type weekend. So, but gentlemen, the affectionate sentiment of esteem and approbation which you are so good to express towards me on behalf of the Dansbury Baptist Association give me the highest satisfaction. My duties dictate a faithful and zealous pursuit of the interest of my constituents. in proportion as they are persuaded of my fidelity to those duties, the discharge of them becomes more and more pleasing. Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only and not opinions. Note, it still says reach actions, but not opinions. I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declare that their legislators should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. Adhering to this expression of the Supreme Court, of the supreme will of the nation in behalf of the rights of conscience, I shall see with sincere satisfaction the progress of those sentiments which tend to restore to man all his natural rights, which he has convinced he has no natural right in opposition to his social duties. I reciprocate your kind prayers for the protection and blessing of the common Father and Creator of man, and tender you for yourselves, your religious association, assurances of my high respect and esteem. So it's another. All these letters are fascinating because he walks through. He doesn't put a lot of limits necessarily in this letter on government. Let's see. So he didn't really add even directly. Well, basically, I'll say it as a summary. He tells them effectively, don't worry, you're free to worship whoever you want, and that with the Second Amendment, make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free expression thereof. That they were guaranteed that the state was not going to interfere with them worshiping God as they saw fit. And so that, of course, that letter, I mean, that's the First Amendment. No, I said Second Amendment. But the First Amendment, that's like literally the first thing they added. First Amendment was that people in this country are going to be free to worship God as you please. But it's interesting and from this letter to Baptist, to actual Baptist, is sort of the idea of the wall of separation between church and state, or where that language anyway comes from. And it has, of course, been taken kind of out of context a little bit at times. But what he does intend with this is to say you're guaranteed we're not going to persecute you for your religious beliefs. And so I don't know if that makes you a little bit proud to be Southern Baptist. It does me, but looking back through the Southern Baptist Faith and Message, very consistent. People should be free to worship God as they please, and opinions should not be should not be punished for their opinions, religious opinions. And there's a long history of the Baptists taking that viewpoint. Like I said, Baptists were some of the ones persecuted, actually, who were persecuted even in this country early on, which I don't know if all of you knew that or not. So. But yeah, and that brings us though to a close on what I have to cover on this. I don't have anything else. So I hope everybody has a great day. I'll say lead us in a quick prayer and we'll be done. And Lord, thank you for this country. Thank you for freedom, for all the things you provide for us. Thank you for your blessings. Please be with each member of our class and be with our leaders as well and those around the country, Lord. Um, Watch over, please give wisdom to people. I know we're in desperate need of wisdom in these times. But just thank you, Jesus, for so many opportunities that you've given to us. Thank you for sending your son to die on a cross for our sins, Lord. Thank you for giving us the freedom to choose to follow you, Lord. And yes, thank you for many blessings. In your name we pray. Amen. All right, thank you guys. I hope all of y'all have a great rest of your day. Happy July 4th.